Next week, the Republican National Convention kicks off with 4 days of pageantry for Donald Trump. But the MAGA festival we are expecting will be just a taste of what goes on down at Mar-a-Lago on a daily basis and just a glimpse of what a second Trump White House might look like. A new New York Times analysis shows that Mar-a-Lago has become a gathering place for some of the most extreme factions of the right wing. The analysis found that events hosted by ultra-right organizations and political fundraisers now dominate Mar-a-Lago's calendar, and even officially non-political events can feel like rallies. In this gilded echo chamber, Mr. Trump enjoys unwavering devotion and collects the staggering price of admission. Joining me now is David Fahrenthold. He's an investigative reporter for The Times, and his byline is on this amazing and interactive new reporting. David, thanks for joining me. I think a lot of people wonder how the MAGA sort of worldview has come to be crystallized, and it feels like Mar-a-Lago plays an instrumental role in sort of cementing the Trump narrative in Trump's own mind and rallying the MAGA troops. Who is now populating the halls of Mar-a-Lago from your reporting?
Well, it's been a huge shift. As recently as 2017, most of what happened in Mar-a-Lago was just sort of Palm Beach society balls, Red Cross, Salvation Army, that sort of thing. In that year, 2017, because of what Trump said about the rioters in Charlottesville, that they were very fine people among them, a lot of those society clients left. And for a while, there was sort of a hole in the social calendar at Mar-a-Lago. But now that has been filled by a whole new set of people. And some of them are political campaigns, including Trump's own. But a lot of them are just nonprofits or other groups that are aligned with Trump's politics. So, nonprofits started by his administration alumni, started by people like Mike Flynn, the people who basically are taking the conspiracy theories that sort of Trump's voters believed in before and now sort of making them into policy, making them into a movement and bringing them sort of to the forefront of Mar-a-Lago, where you're right, physically they're together with the Republican mainstream and they start to infuse the Republican mainstream.
And when you talk about the conspiracies that are accepted as truth, we're talking about fringe ideas, including the Pizzagate theory, which I'd love for you to expand upon, and other, Looney Tune ideas that have no basis in reality, but inside the walls of Mar-a-Lago, that's what actually happened. That's fact. Is that right?
That's right. Frequently, people on the stage, this is not just somebody talking in a corner somewhere. These are people on the stage at these events, speaking to people in Mar-a-Lago's ballroom, often with Trump there. They say, this 2020 election was stolen. January 6th was somehow set up by the feds. And as you said, Pizzagate is real. Those of you who don't remember Pizzagate, it's a conspiracy that there's a pizzeria here in Washington that is a place where Democrats molest children and kill them and eat them. And just an outlandish, false conspiracy theory that there in that bubble, people say is true. So, yeah, it's a place where you can deny reality and find a bunch of other people who will deny it together with you.
I think what should bring chills down everyone's spine is this is not, as you say, this is not just relegated to the Mar-a-Lago, right? Donald Trump is the presumed nominee. This is a place where his aides gather. This is a place where this kind of conspiracy fear-mongering is infecting other Republicans. Do you think, like the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., Mar-a-Lago is representative of the sort of Trump project and the people who are in Mar-a-Lago now talking about Pizzagate, talking about how January 6th was an inside job, that those are the people that you're going to see at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Do you get the sense that these are the loyalists that Trump will want to bring with him if he goes back to Washington, D.C.?
I do. And that's important to remember as we think about Trump in a potential next term. People think, well, there was a lot of craziness in his first term, but, nothing much changed. And that was true in some cases because of the people that Trump brought with him. He didn't have anybody who was sort of mirroring his ideology. He brought a lot of people who were sort of just Republican mainstream people. And a lot of them saw their jobs as sort of keeping Trump away from the policymaking and keeping things mainstream. That wouldn't happen again. This would be a very different administration. And you're right. The people that are around him Mar-a-Lago now, they're there because they realize that's what he's like. They realize he's malleable, distractible, and that if he gets elected again, they can be the ones who get in and start making policy. So I think it's very important to look at who's around him physically and who's paying him at Mar-a-Lago, because those will be the people. They're not going to make that mistake again. They're going to be there in the White House with Trump making policy if he's reelected.
Is there anybody sounding the alarm inside Mar-a-Lago? Sort of the reality bell? Is anyone ringing it?
No, I mean, the people who were there have been some members, old-time members, who have left. But that's the reaction. I think people just go elsewhere. If you wanted to make a change, Mar-a-Lago would be a place where no one would listen to you. You know, people have selected. That's a self-selected crowd of people who want to be there around Trump and want Trump to see them. So no, I don't think there's anyone within Mar-a-Lago trying to change the place from the inside. I think they just leave.
It is, for anybody who hasn't seen it, I highly encourage. There's video, there are pictures. It really brings to life a terrifying subculture that could very well be in the White House in 2025. It's essential reporting from the New York Times. David Fahrenthold, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you.
As congressional Democrats have family discussions over President Biden's political future, House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries has told worried lawmakers in his party that he plans to relay their concerns directly to the president himself. President Biden, for his part, has spoken to a select group of Hill lawmakers, including the Congressional Black Caucus, which has voiced its support for Biden. But a similar statement of support from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus reportedly caused tension among members who felt it was released without the group's complete buy-in. The president has also spoken to certain individual lawmakers, but as of right now, he is not planning to call into a meeting with Senate Democrats tomorrow afternoon. Instead, Biden plans to send his campaign chair and senior advisors to speak with the senators instead. Joining me now is Jackie Alemany, congressional investigations reporter for The Washington Post. Jackie, thank you for being here. I think a lot of us who don't cover the Hill are kind of confused about the dynamics here. One of the reasons we're focused so much on the Hill is if there is a sort of engine for either the Keep Biden In movement or Take Biden Out movement, it seems to be sort of headquartered among the elected members of this party. And I wonder what you think transpired between yesterday, when it seemed like the movement to oust Biden had sort of gone quiet, and this morning when Nancy Pelosi came on our network and suggested that the sort of deliberations were very much not over.
Yeah, Alex, it's certainly been an emotional roller coaster for these lawmakers since they returned to Washington, especially in the House, as they've been really agonizing over this debacle in the weeks since Joe Biden's faltering and disastrous debate performance. But if the stakes couldn't have already been higher, Nancy Pelosi certainly raised them this morning with her comments on Morning Joe. They were subtle, but deliberate and very precise, and a really significant reframing of a delicate but urgent conversation that is happening not just amongst lawmakers right now, but everywhere in the party for Democrats. But what Pelosi really did was she sort of reframed this conversation. She is an institutionalist at the end of the day. So her making these comments was highly significant, especially as a number of lawmakers who were privately grumbling about Biden and his unwillingness to hear from members, hear their concerns firsthand, and maybe reconsider his decision. This is someone who they heard from who might now have opened the door for people to sort of have the flexibility to potentially change their minds, especially when it comes to Biden's performance on Thursday, when he's going to have this press conference after NATO. There's been a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about whether or not he's going to be able to deliver a performance that is going to finally allay a lot of the concerns that we're seeing. And there is sort of an expectation that he's not going to be able to. And in that case, what is the path forward? There is a feeling that the former speaker is now making paving the way for lawmakers to have an exit ramp.
Do you have a sense of the sort of dynamics between the Democrats in the House and the Senate on this topic? Because up until literally a few hours ago, when Peter Welch became the first senator to say Biden shouldn't be at the top of the ticket, it had felt like this. Typically, the Senate was taking a sort of more deliberative path on this. But that sort of seems to have flipped in the last 12 hours with Michael Bennet and John Tester and Peter Welch publicly calling for Biden to step down. And then sort of there were pockets of support for Biden among the Congressional Black Caucus, at least, and to some degree among the Congressional House Caucus. Like, how are those dynamics playing out between the upper and lower chamber?
Yeah, well, if there is one commonality between the two chambers, it's that both chambers have been feeling like, in the absence of robust communication and response, that is satisfying to lawmakers in the House and in the Senate, that they've lost even more confidence in Biden and the operation around him. They were expecting sort of a full court press, individual calls, outreach from Biden and his team. They haven't seen that. So one House aide told me today, and I know that this is felt similarly in the Senate, that if one of the top leaders in the party called the White House switchboard and tried to get through to President Biden, they're not sure anyone really could at this point in time. All of these concerns have been compounded in both chambers by the awful polling that lawmakers have seen in the few days. I don't think it's a surprise that you've seen a handful of New York lawmakers today in the House suddenly tweak their previous statements and change their minds. Representative Pat Ryan came out and said and was the 8th or the 9th House lawmaker to call for Biden to make a change and to give up the top of the ticket. So I think this lack of communication is something that both sides are struggling with. I think that there's also this dynamic that both Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer are dealing with as well, which is there are still some divisions. There are still some members who feel like, yes, Joe Biden is an imperfect candidate, but he's never been impressive. And this is our lot. And by coming out publicly and continuing to criticize him, we're just making our electoral chances worse. We'll see, though, just how far those people are able to hold their ground within their caucuses.
Yeah, but Jackie, when you talk about holding their ground, it feels like the people we hear most from, and again, it's sort of hedged conversations and hedged statements, are the people who appear skeptical of Biden staying at the top of the ticket. I'm struck by the lack of sort of passionate support for this president, given especially what the White House says is, a vast number of voters out there who still support him. I mean, does that surprise you?
It doesn't. I mean, I know we've talked a lot about this public versus this private conversation, but I will say overwhelmingly, my colleagues and I have spoken to dozens and dozens of lawmakers this week. And even the ones who are upbeat publicly have articulated concerns in private. There is this sort of resignation that if Joe Biden stays atop the ticket, that he is facing defeat against President Trump. I mean, as one senior aide told me point blank, we have no path to take back the House if Biden stays at the top of the ticket. And that's why Nancy Pelosi's comments this morning, I think, were so significant, even though they were quite subtle. She's someone who, again, lives and dies by the House. And at the end of the day, her priority is the House. So she didn't feel that the House was that Democrats were in danger of missing the opportunity to recapture the House. I don't think we would be seeing this commentary and sort of this milquetoast support for Biden from her.
Jackie Alemany with the Washington Post. Thanks for your great reporting tonight, Jackie. It's really helpful.
Thanks, Alex.
Polling in the aftermath of the first presidential debate paints a kind of a mixed picture for President Biden. According to a Wall Street Journal poll last week, 76% of Democrats think President Biden is too old to run this year. But according to a national poll commissioned by a top Democratic pollster this week, when asked if they would vote for Biden anyway in order to keep Trump out of the White House, 75% of Democrats who responded said yes. Joining me now is Fernand Amandi, a Democratic pollster and an MSNBC political analyst. Fernand, these numbers are so confusing. Please help me understand them. I mean, does this explain why President Biden is reluctant to do anything here? Because, yes, Democrats may think he shouldn't be on the top of the ticket, but they're almost overwhelmingly going to still vote for him anyway.
Well, Alex, you're exactly right. I mean, the numbers are a little schizo, but the reason for that kind of contradictory numbers that you see in those two polls, I think really can be answered in two words, and that's Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is, Alex, whoever the Democratic nominee is, Democrats are going to vote for that individual en masse because the only thing that matters is who the Republican nominee is. And the idea now that there's a lot of questions about whether or not it's going to be Joe Biden as the nominee or not, that really is kind of immaterial because there is going to be a focusing of the mind once we are past the point of no return, whether that's President Biden as the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, or someone else. And the stakes will then become clear that this is an election that is a choice between American democracy and the continuance of it after 248 years, or a conscientious movement into autocracy and authoritarian dictatorship as Donald Trump himself has pledged to be on more than one occasion, Alex, on day one.
Yeah, it also, I mean, to your point, it could be President Biden. It could be Vice President Harris. It could be, I don't know, a Democratic governor unnamed as yet. But the fact of the matter you're saying is that that Democratic resistance to Donald Trump, the feeling that he poses an existential threat to democracy, is strong enough, is motivating enough that Democrats are going to basically go with whoever's at the top of the ticket.
There's no doubt about it. And the poll that I just conducted yesterday, the national poll, to me, Alex, there was a stark number there. Maybe the most important one that, in my judgment, is one that Democrats should take heart of. And that is, we asked the question, do you think if Donald Trump is elected to another term, will he and his administration represent a grave threat to American democracy continuing in the United States? 53% of all voters, including 22%, by the way, of Republicans, answered yes to that question. So if the Democrats can, again, make this case and make this election choice a referendum between what Biden would represent or whoever the Democratic nominee is, which is continuing the way the country has been the world superpower as a functioning democracy and republic, or this dictatorship authoritarian project that we see the 2025 project and other areas articulating that it would be commenced under Trump, that choice is the choice that this election is going to be ultimately defined around.
Fernando, I'm going to ask you a question I don't know if you know the answer to, so bear with me. But you say there are 22% of Republicans who find Trump distasteful, that are alarmed by Donald Trump, that think he poses a grave danger to the republic. Do you think that sense of alarm is as powerful as the Democratic sense of alarm that Republicans will pull the lever for whoever isn't Donald Trump in November?
Well, look, I mean, I think that the question that you mentioned earlier, would folks vote for, if it's President Biden who's the nominee, regardless of what happens, if he shows signs of advanced aging and is unable to complete a full 4-year term into the future, only 44% said they would do that just to stop Donald Trump. That's where you kind of see that other question where 53%, a majority, are saying they believe Trump is a threat to the democracy. So you do have some folks in the middle. A lot of them are probably not watching this program candidly. We are all the junkies here. I think everyone watching tonight knows the stakes. But those voters that are maybe not as attuned to the process, they may have concerns about Donald Trump, of course, but at the same time, they look at some of the issues around President Biden. It's not quite enough for them to necessarily vote against Trump when they see the concerns about President Biden.
It's hard to understand whether aside from, the reality of the calendar, it's hard to understand what the urgency, whether there is a point whether there is a point of no return for this Democratic debate about who should be at the top of the ticket. I mean, given the sense of alarm, the distaste for Trump, that seems baked in. I wonder if there's a point at which the Democratic family conversation needs to end, in terms of public support for the party itself.
That's a great question, Alex. It has a very clear answer. Once the Democratic convention is over and we have our nominee as a party, that is when the conversation will come to a complete halt. And I anticipate, at least at that point, Democrats will come together as a Democratic family and get behind the nominee. The question, however, is between now and then, there is still an opportunity, whether, again, it's President Biden or someone else. That decision is still not defined. And that's why I think you have this consensus. Had this happened later in the process, I think you would still see the Democratic Party completely in lockstep behind President Biden. The reason right now that this anxiety exists is because under no circumstances can Donald Trump be permitted to win the election because of the grave threat he would represent.
Fernando Mondi, thank you for helping break down some seemingly impenetrable numbers. I appreciate it.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.